Let's turn to Romans chapter 2. We'll be continuing our study, getting ready for this Bible Bowl. And I'm pacing myself through the book of Romans at the rate of the Bible Bowl. The Bible Bowl will be next Sunday over Romans chapters 1 and 2. Now the next one is 3, 4, and 5. And so we'll be covering them at that pace. I'll be doing 3, 4, and 5 next month. And that's a little unnatural for me, but I'm going to pace it just like the Bible Bowl does. Let's look where we are. I'm going to show you this every time. You can read the whole thing. This is where we're going. And right now, we're all have sinned. That's the gist of Romans 1, verses 18 through Romans 3 and verse 20. Paul, to all who are in Rome, and the first point is, all have sinned. Now, in looking at that, we've talked about God's wrath against the unrighteous and God's wrath against the self-righteous. And so tonight we're going to see how that applies specifically to the self-righteous Jews. They thought they were the exception. God would judge all the Gentiles, but somehow they thought they would escape because they were Jews. But that's not how God's plan works, and they're going to have to learn that, and Paul's going to talk about that. All of this establishes, this fact that all have sinned establishes the need for the gospel. It's a gospel for all, because all have sinned. So we'll get to that. Now, it'll be Romans 2:17 to Romans 3 and verse 8. We won't get all the way through this. I'm going to stop at the end of Romans 2. My son-in-law, Justin Reed, is going to pick this up next Sunday evening. I won't be here, but Sunday evening after the Bible Bowl, he's going to pick this up and carry us through chapter 3 and verse 20. And that'll also then include this conclusion where all have sinned. That's where we're going with all of this. So that shows you where we've been, where we're going. And now let's zero in on the study tonight. The application to the Jews. Here's how this breaks down into 4 parts. What the Jews thought of themselves. That'll be Romans 2:17 through 20. Where the Jews were at fault. That's Romans 2:21 through 24. And the fault of the Jews illustrated by circumcision. That was just a part of the problem, but that's the one he's going to bring up and say it's just like it is with circumcision and it is with many other things concerning the Jews. Well, we'll see that as we get to Romans 2:25 through 29. Justin's going to pick up next Sunday and talk about some anticipated objections to what Paul has said. There's going to be 3 of them, 3 anticipated objections, but I'll let him cover that when we come to Romans chapter 3. Now, let's get a look at where we've been with God's wrath against the self-righteous. And I want you to keep the Jews in mind as we read over this. We won't be going to it in detail, but keep the Jews in mind, and you'll see how this latter section fits right into what we studied the first part of Romans chapter 2. And use your memories on what we've discussed. Therefore thou art inexcusable, O man, whosoever thou art that judgest. For wherein thou judgest another, thou condemnest thyself. For thou that judgest dost the same things. But we're sure that the judgment of God is according to truth against them that do such things. And thinkest thou this, O man, that judgest them that do such things and dost the same, that thou shalt escape the judgment of God? Or despisest thou the riches of his goodness and forbearance and longsuffering, not knowing that the goodness of God leadeth thee to repentance? But after thy hardness and impenitent heart treasurest up unto thyself wrath, against the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will render to every man according to his deeds. To them who by patient continuance in well-doing seek for glory and honor and immortality, everlasting life. But unto them that are contentious and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, indignation and wrath, tribulation and anguish upon every soul of man that doeth evil, of the Jew first and also to the Gentile. But glory and honor and peace to every man that worketh good, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. For there's no respect of persons with God. For as many as have sinned without law shall also perish without law. And as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, these having not the law are law unto themselves, which show the work of the law written in their hearts, the conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the mean, while accusing or else excusing one another. Let's go back. Verse 12. Skip the parentheses now. For as many as have sinned without law shall also perish without law, and as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law in the day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ, according to my gospel. Verse 16. How's that apply to the Jews? He's already getting into the subject, isn't it? But now we're going to see. He says, behold, thou art called a Jew. He has zeroed right in on them now. When he's talking about the self-righteous, make no mistake, he's turned the light directly to the Jews. And the Jews called themselves Jews. I was reading in a commentary this afternoon about something called the middle. Let's see, there's the active, the passive, and the middle. We don't have a middle in English, but the middle is talking about an action you do to yourself. And this commentator was saying this should probably be translated, behold, you call yourselves Jews. Instead of passively, you're called Jews. Behold, you call yourselves Jews. That word Jew, think where that came from. They were called Israelites, but those northern tribes are carried away into Syrian captivity and spread among the nations, and they were lost to history. When people talk about the lost tribes of Israel, that's what they're talking about, those northern tribes. What was left was mostly the tribe of Judah. There was the little tribe of Benjamin. There was a lot of the Levites that stayed with Judah because the temple was in Jerusalem. After the Babylonian captivity, when those of Judah returned, that's when they started being called the Jews, after Judah. And all who were of Israel that retained that identity of being of Israel just accepted that name of the Jews. You remember Jacob's promise to Judah. The name means praise. Jacob said to Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise. They were proud that they called themselves Jews. Either behold, thou art called a Jews, or behold, you call yourselves Jews, whatever. They took pride in that name. Now, we're the Jews. In fact, in the mind of the Jews, the world was divided into two kinds of people. You either are a Jew or you're not a Jew. If you're not a Jew, you're a Gentile. And that's how they just saw the world. And we're the Jews. You know, I'm kind of proud that I'm an American. I see the world sometimes as the Americans and everybody else, and maybe you do too. I'm kind of glad in America I'm from Tennessee. I see myself as a Tennessean, and then I see everybody else. But I hope I don't take that pride too far to think that, well, that just automatically makes me better than everyone else. No, that doesn't automatically do that. I've still got to be the person of character that I need to be. But the Jews thought that their being Jews, that sort of set them apart from everyone else in God's eyes, and so the rules don't apply to them. Thou art called a Jew. Look, they restest in the law. That was where their confidence was. Why, God, He chose us out of all the nations of the world, and He gave us the law. It wasn't to all the world. And that's what we've got to remember when we study the law of Moses. It never was intended to be a law for all the world. If it was, it would not have fulfilled its purpose, because its very design was to keep the Jews separated from all of the world. It was through this nation God was going to work His plan of salvation for all the world. It didn't mean that all the Jews would be saved. It simply means they were set apart, and they were going to be treated separate until God fulfilled His plan for the gospel to go into all the world. But they took a lot of comfort. God gave us a law, a written law, by the hand of Moses. He didn't do that to anybody else. And they took comfort in that. They rested in that. And then it says they made their boast of God. Well, in a sense, that would have been a good thing. They were proud that the Jehovah of the Old Testament was their God, particularly when they were scattered among the nations. And they saw these false gods that all the other nations were worshiping. Oh, they were glad they had Jehovah their God. Why, Jehovah's a God that made heaven and earth and all that in them is. He's the only true God. They had been separated from that idolatry which had plagued them in their history, and they took their boast in God. They knew His will. They knew what God wanted. Well, it was spelled out to them in words, in writing, and they'd been taught that from their synagogues. They knew what God wanted out of them, and they approved the things that are more excellent being instructed out of the law. Knowing God's law, they understood something of God, and in what we now call a worldview, they were able to distinguish between what was good and what was better, and what was better and what was best. And they sought after those things that were the very best, because they had a law to teach them and to give them a standard by which they could measure all these things in the world. Solomon, remember, chasing all the things of the world, all is vanity. And they knew to fear God and keep His commandments. That was the best. And they were confident. Being confident thou thyself art a guide of the blind, a light of them which are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, and a teacher of babes. They thought, we are here to show the whole world how they ought to behave themselves. And so they saw themselves as scattered for that purpose, that they could set a standard for the world on how they should behave. Now, they had the form of knowledge and truth in the law. That's interesting. The form. It wasn't the final, poured and hardened result. It was just the form. It was the shadow of things to come. But it was a form of the knowledge and of the truth that they had in the law. It would be fulfilled in the gospel. Now, where the Jews were at fault with all that? Well, here it is. Thou therefore that teachest another, teachest thou not thyself? It's a rhetorical question. You're teaching others how they ought to be. What about, do you ever teach yourself? What about you? Let me get specific. Thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal? You know, it's easy to teach people not to steal. What about stealing? Somehow they thought they was getting away with their stealing while others should not steal. What about adultery? Thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery, dost thou commit adultery? Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? Now that's a little difficult. I think if you look at the context, the Jews are doing what they were telling others they should not do. So they abhorred idols, that's what they would say. But they would go into those heathen temples, and maybe they'd take an idol home with them. The word means a robber of temples, commit sacrilege. They wouldn't treat holy things like they were holy and give them their due, but the implication is they were kind of dallying in this idolatry a little bit themselves. And that's how they were committing sacrilege. Thou that makest thy boast of the law, through breaking the law, dishonorest thou God? That's asked as a question. But it could be a statement. Because here they were bragging about having the law of God, and yet they're guilty of stealing. They're guilty of adultery. They're guilty of sacrifice, and it brought dishonor upon God among the Gentiles. The very people that should have been drawn to God by the Jews' behavior were thought to dishonor God because they saw the hypocrisy of those Jews. The name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you, as it is written. To blaspheme means to speak against. And rather than the Gentiles seeing the Jews in their sincerity worshiping God, seeing them in their hypocrisy, they thought less of the God that the Jews worshiped. And it was written that it would be the case. It's back in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah 52 and verse 5. Now therefore what have I here, saith the Lord, that my people is taken away for naught? They rule over them, make them howl, saith the Lord. He said, Lord, look what we've got here. My own people, they're captive and prisoners, all these others, and they're scattered all over the world, and others ruling them. That doesn't bring me glory. And not only that, it says, my name is continually every day is blasphemed. It's not blasphemed because the Jews were in captivity. But we see from the book of Romans, it is being blasphemed because of the way the Jews were behaving themselves in captivity. And so it was written that such would be the case. Now, the fault of the Jews is illustrated by circumcision. I was asking class, what is circumcision? I want the parents to help me, and you can explain that at home better than I could in that class. I said it's a special cut for baby boys that set them apart, and they were a little curious. So parents, you can take care of that and talk about that. I think it'd be better with the group I'm with to just talk about that at home and explain that. But it says circumcision verily profiteth if thou keep the law. You see, circumcision was the way a little Jew baby boy was brought under the covenant. And if they were not brought under the covenant, they themselves would be cut off from the covenant. But the little baby, that was 8 days old when that occurred. The little baby had no knowledge of this, but they would be taught, now you're a child of the covenant growing up, and here's the law that we're to live under. But if they wouldn't follow that law, that circumcision wasn't going to help them. God wanted to keep them as children of the covenant. If they weren't going to follow the law, it doesn't count then. It says circumcision verily profiteth. That means it'll count if thou keep the law. But if thou be a breaker of the law, thy circumcision is made uncircumcision. It's just like you never were circumcised. Therefore, if the uncircumcision keep the righteousness of the law. Now, that doesn't mean the uncircumcised had to keep all the things peculiar that were to the Jews. But if the uncircumcised, if they didn't steal, if they didn't commit sacrilege, if they didn't commit adultery, If they were living right the way that the law would have people to live, if they shall not his uncircumcision be counted for circumcision, God would rather have that out of the uncircumcised than he would out of the circumcised that weren't keeping that law. And shall not uncircumcision, which is by nature, if it fulfill the law, judge thee, who by the letter and circumcision does transgress the law. Here's one of the problems the Jews had. They were good at trying to keep the letter, but they weren't good at living up to the behavior standards of the law. It wasn't in their heart. It was on the outside, keeping the letter of it. But they weren't keeping the spirit of it also. And that's what he's going to talk about next. The fault of the Jews. Now watch this. He is not a Jew which is one outwardly. Notice the outward and the inward here. He is not a Jew which is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew which is one inwardly, and the circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God. I've had people read things like that in the Bible to me and tell me that now that we're under the New Testament, we don't have to keep the letter of the law. We just keep the spirit of the law, we'll be good enough, and we don't have to worry about the letter of the law. I've asked them, well, how can you keep the spirit of the law without keeping the letter of the law? How do you do that? Well, what is this teaching us here? I want you to remember the elliptical statement. We're going to keep coming up with elliptical statements in Paul's writings. It's just part of his style. And Paul wrote as though he thought we had enough sense to see this. An elliptical statement is a statement where you're kind of saying things in an abbreviated way. And you might leave some words out that would make it clarify. But I don't have to make it any clearer than that. They're going to understand this. And the Jews would talk to each other this way. And so they were familiar with hearing elliptical statements. And maybe we're not always familiar with hearing that. In elliptical statement, many times the thought can be completed by using the words only and also. Look at the last question on the questions we pointed out. I've got the blanks there where you can fill in the onlys and the alsos. And once I do this, you're going to see how this is so clear. It's kind of like when Paul said, well, Christ sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel. And people have said that. See, God didn't want Paul baptizing people. Put the only and also in there. Christ sent me not to baptize only, but to preach the gospel also. And the emphasis is always on the also. Okay, let's try that here. Here's how it works, and you'll see, and it'll be so clear. He is not a Jew which is one outwardly only. Neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh only. But he is a Jew which is one inwardly also. And circumcision is that of the heart also, in the spirit also, and not in the letter only, whose praise is not of men only, but of God also. Didn't that make it clear? It wasn't enough for a Jew to act like a Jew and to behave like a Jew and look like a Jew on the outside when his heart wasn't right. When he wasn't keeping the spirit of the law, he might keep it to the letter, but he's not going to keep the spirit of the law. And he's not even going to live up to the standards of the law, but he'll do all the outside ritual. That's what the Pharisees were doing. And that's why Christ condemned them. Now that doesn't mean, you remember when he said you pay tithes of mint and cumin? He said these ought ye to have done and not left the other undone. And so they did need to do that which was outward in the flesh. God expected that. But God expected them to obey Him from the heart also. And to understand the significance of that which was outward on the character they were to have in their hearts also. So, here's some lessons for us. This is not what Paul was teaching, but looking at what Paul, the way he's talking to the Jews, what about us? Could he say something like this to us? And sometime he could. Sometime we've got members of the church today behaving a lot like the Jews had been behaving under the law. So here's 3 lessons I want us to take home for us. Number 1, it's not enough to have the law. Even to know the law, we need to keep the law. And so having a Bible, and you might know it. You may know your Bible well. If you don't do what the Bible says, you hadn't done enough. We've got to do what it teaches. Number 2, people will judge our religion by our lives. That's what was happening to the Jews. And they were blaspheming the God of the Jews because of the hypocrisy of the Jews. But people are going to judge Christianity by the way they see Christians behave too. And we've got to remember that when we're out here in the world and people know that, hey, I go to the Church of Christ at Rockcliffe. I tell you, the way you behave is going to be a reflection on all of us. And we've got to keep that in mind. We represent the whole when we're out there. And people will judge all of us by the behavior of a few. But then also, our observance must not be outward only, but from the heart also. If you come every Sunday and you partake of the Lord's Supper and remember the death of Christ on the cross, and that does not make you want to be a sacrificial servant for others, then you're missing the point. You're doing all the forms, you're going through all the rituals, you're doing all the things, and from the outside it looks like you're doing those stuff, but what is it doing to your heart? And the Christianity is to be written in the hearts. The new covenant is to be written in the hearts of man. And once it's there in the heart, what we do on the outside becomes almost natural and normal because it reflects from the heart. We are reformed from the inside out and not from the outside in. So I say there's 3 take-home lessons we can learn from the Jews. Not enough to keep the law, even know the law, or to have the law or even know it. We got to keep it. People will judge our religion by our lives, and our observance must not be outward only, but from the heart also. I want to extend the invitation. You need to be a Christian. I've heard people called the true blue Jew. Okay, that's a Jew. They got the bloodline, and that's what Paul was. Paul would have said, I'm a true blue Jew. Had the bloodline and did all the things the Jews were supposed to do. But what we need to do is true blue Christians. We need to be the real thing and demonstrate that by our lives. If you haven't done that, well, you need to be baptized into Christ first. And then if you've embarrassed the Lord by your behavior, and that's well known, it's known among us, you need to tell us you're sorry. And there is forgiveness when you do that. And we go on from there. So, if you want to come, while we stand and sing the invitation song, The Wonderful Story of Love.